Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Batman the Cult. Now, The Cult is a graphic novel written by Jim Starlin, illustrated by Bernie Wrightson, and of course published by DC Comics, originally as a 4-issue comic book series published in 1988, and then later on all 4 issues were collected as one graphic novel or trade paperback. And this features the character of Batman, originally created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, and I'm doing this review as part of my yearly series of Batman reviews, which is something I try to do at the beginning of every year. Now, Jim Starlin also wrote the Batman story arc A Death in the Family, and he co-created the character of Thanos for Marvel. He actually wrote that original Infinity Gauntlet storyline for Marvel, which of course is what later inspired Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. But Bernie Wrightson, the illustrator of this comic, he co-created Swamp Thing along with Len Wein, and he did an acclaimed comic book adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Actually, Bernie Wrightson is probably best known for his horror comics and illustrations. He's collaborated with Stephen King many times. He did the graphic novel adaptation of Creepshow. He also did the illustrations for Cycle of the Werewolf and the 1990 version of The Stand, and the illustrated version of Wolves of the Kala, the 5th Dark Tower novel. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. He died in 2017, but this comic does have a pretty good pedigree behind it. You have 2 legends in the comic book field working on this. Now, The Cult doesn't seem to get talked about nearly as much as stuff like Dark Knight Returns, Year One, The Killing Joke, Arkham Asylum, or even the aforementioned Death in the Family, and it really should, because upon reading this, honestly, this clearly influenced a lot of Batman media going forward, so I'm surprised it's not talked about as much as those other comics I just mentioned. So, The Cult is a horror story set within the Batman universe. Basically, we follow this charismatic religious leader known as Deacon Blackfire, who comes to Gotham City, claiming not only to be a messenger of God, but actually claiming to be the Messiah. And Blackfire builds up a following among the city's homeless population and the disenfranchised and people who have been victimized by society, and he claims that he wants to cleanse the city of crime and corruption, and feels that Batman is too soft on criminals. And the comic actually begins where Batman has already been abducted by this cult, and they torture and drug him, and they actually do brainwash him. Batman actually does become a follower of Deacon Blackfire in the beginning of this story. And basically, Blackfire's followers, along with Batman, go out and they go after mob bosses and drug dealers and human traffickers, and they actually kill these people. Now, Batman doesn't take part in the killings, but he also doesn't do anything to stop it either. Eventually, the media finds out about this cult and their agenda, and there are people in the media who are pro-Blackfire. They're like, hey, they're killing all the right people. So Blackfire gains sort of a following through the media as well. Meanwhile, Robin, Jason Todd, has to rescue Batman, and when Batman is finally recovered from this brainwashing, it turns out that Blackfire's cult, which is really more of a militia, has essentially taken over Gotham City. So now Batman and Robin must save Gotham City, but Batman specifically wants revenge on Blackfire for doing what none of his enemies up until that point have been able to do, and that's break him. So, The Cult is a very good comic, and in this we see a side to Batman that even to this day we don't normally see. We see a Batman that actually is broken. We see a Batman that actually is capable of being brainwashed. Like, of course he's beaten and drugged, but for a brief period, Batman is actually convinced that Deacon Blackfire is an agent of God. And Batman actually does give up. After Jason Todd saves him from the cult, they flee the city, and then Batman's basically like, yeah, there's nothing I can do about this. So he abandons Gotham for a little bit. Of course, he eventually realizes, yeah, I have to stop Deacon Blackfire, but again, in this story, we see Batman mentally broken. And a lot of the story really is about Batman having to overcome this brainwashing, having to overcome what Blackfire did to him. Now, in the story, the cult does start off as sort of a vigilante group where all the people they're killing are legitimately bad people, but Batman's moral code is he doesn't kill no matter what, that everybody's worthy of redemption. And they point out the flaws of Batman's moral code, that maybe some people aren't worthy of redemption, and with every criminal Batman helps put away, another one is let out to victimize somebody else. But by killing these people, that makes them just as bad as the criminals they're fighting, and as we learn in this story, not everybody that the cult kills is necessarily evil. In fact, we learn that there are certain followers of Deacon Blackfire who are only there for their own selfish reasons. And when this cult/militia does ultimately take over Gotham City, Blackfire essentially runs it like a fascist dictatorship, and he's killing everybody who defies him, be that men, women, or even children. And the Deacon is an interesting villain, and definitely calls to mind real-life cult leaders like Charles Manson, Jim Jones, or Marshall Applewhite. Now, in the story, Blackfire convinces his followers that he's immortal, that he's been around for hundreds of years, and we also see him bathing in the blood of his victims, believing that this will prolong his life. Now, as the story goes on, it appears that all of Blackfire's supernatural powers are just trickery. At the same time, there is a subtle implication that maybe there truly is something supernatural going on with him, like maybe he truly is immortal, because at one point Jim Gordon is investigating into this, and he finds out there was a criminal with the same name all the way back in the 1920s and 30s. But perhaps that was just his father or grandfather, but at the same time, we never get a definitive, concrete answer for that either. And remember, the supernatural does exist in the DC universe. I mean, Swamp Thing, Sandman, and Hellblazer do technically take place in this universe. Granted, I've always liked to consider the Vertigo stuff to be in a slightly separate continuity from the mainstream DC continuity, but regardless, we know that the supernatural exists in the mainstream DC universe, so the idea that Deacon Blackfire truly is supernatural, it's not beyond the realm of possibility in this universe. And Bernie Wrightson's artwork in this is masterful. There's a reason this guy was a comic book legend, and you definitely see Wrightson's horror roots in this, because there are these really creepy hallucinatory sequences, because throughout a lot of this, because of the drugs that the cult gave him, Batman is hallucinating. And there's some very creepy, very nightmarish imagery in this. Now, you could tell that this comic was heavily influenced by Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, because there is a lot of satire on the media in this, where you see a lot of these talking heads on the news debating whether what Blackfire is doing is right or wrong. You see a lot of people being interviewed on the streets talking about how, oh, I think Blackfire's doing a great job. And even the way Batman defeats Deacon Blackfire in this is somewhat similar, at least thematically, to how Frank Miller's version of Batman defeated the mutant leader in The Dark Knight Returns. Now, I do think Dark Knight Returns was a stronger work, and I thought the satire in that was a little better integrated into the story than in here. But regardless, The Cult is a very good Batman comic that takes the character in some very interesting directions. Now, you can tell this comic definitely influenced the Nightfall story arc from a few years later, and also what the cult does to Batman in this comic is very similar to what the Court of Owls do to Batman during the Scott Snyder run. Honestly, I think Scott Snyder's run on Batman probably owes a lot to this, especially all the horror elements that Scott Snyder incorporated into his run. This was also one of the Batman comics that Christopher Nolan looked to when he made his Dark Knight trilogy, particularly The Dark Knight Rises. There's a lot of this in The Dark Knight Rises. Now, I know the sequel to Matt Reeves' Batman is on hold right now, but honestly, I could almost see a live-action adaptation of this comic set within the Matt Reeves Batman universe. Now, Blackfire would come back basically as a zombie in the DC Comics storyline Blackest Night. And he showed up again during the New 52 era, which rebooted the timeline of the DC universe. He also appeared as a villain in the video game Batman Arkham Knight. So yeah, guys, that was my review of Batman the Cult by Jim Starlin and Bernie Wrightson, and bye.